Hi, I'm Lauren,
And I'm Hilary.
and today's presentation is on sequencing skills in school-aged children. So today we'll be covering what is sequencing, why sequencing is important, how to teach sequencing, and I'll also be sharing some examples of sequencing. So sequencing is arranging information, language, and actions in the correct order. It's a foundational skill to many aspects of language, executive functioning skills. So those are your higher order skills that you use to control and coordinate your actions and behaviors, as well as other academic areas. We use sequencing to follow multi-step directions, complete maths problems, break a big task into small tasks to complete, form complete sentences with correct syntax, or tell a story. Many children struggle with sequencing, and this can cause them to say words in the wrong order or follow instructions just in a different order. And this can impact them in different areas of life, including school, sports, and social situations. Not following steps in the correct order is different from not following instructions, although you may get the same result. So, such as things not being done or things being done incorrectly. This can be perceived as bad behavior, but the problem lies with doing things in the right sequence. There are some red flags that can be identified in the classroom, and this can appear when a child doesn't follow the right steps to solve a maths problem, or when they tell stories that the events are jumbled and hard to follow. In young children, they may say sentences that sound like, hungry I am, instead of I am hungry, or use the wrong tense of a word, such as I run to school. If the order of the words in a sentence are jumbled, as they can also be red flags to look out for. As children get older, this starts affecting more than just their language as they struggle with putting actions and thoughts in the right order. So, a good way for you to probe sequencing difficulties in a classroom could include playing a game of Simon Says. So, you can take note of who's not keeping up, who's copying other children, and you can also use it as a building task to say more complex instructions. Sequencing difficulties can be a result of language deficits, executive functioning issues, or lack of attention skills. It's more than just listening to or reading instructions, and they can also be used with visual aids in the form of visual timetables. And these can be really useful for managing large groups of students with behavioural issues. They can also be used to show what events will be happening throughout the day. So children are always prepared and always will know what is going to happen next, and also to help them establish a routine. The visual aids can be beneficial for children as they can help them to understand and process information quicker. There are many things that can cause trouble with sequencing. So they may not pay attention to the steps, or they could have trouble remembering them, or difficulty with organizing the information. Some children just need more time to process and take in information to make sense of the steps. You might notice some children struggling to complete tasks that may seem really simple, but it's actually made up of a complex series of tasks. So, for example, going to the toilet. You might notice a child squirming in the seat, looking a bit lost, and this could be due to a sequencing difficulty as they're just not sure what to do next. When a child has to go to the toilet, they have to first put their hand up, ask their teacher for permission to go to the bathroom, get up, walk to the bathroom, open the door, go into the bathroom, and then close the door. For older children, in order to read words and comprehend the story, a child has to first perceive a letter, associate a sound with the letter, do the same for all the letters, put the letters into meaningful words, and then to understand the story, they have to follow what happens at the beginning, middle, and end. In a similar way to reading, sequencing skills are important for writing tasks. Sequencing allows students to put words together into logical sentences that follow correct syntax rules. Sentences must also follow a logical sequence to convey appropriate meaning. Across all textual genres, students are expected to sequence their writing appropriately. For example, students who write narratives need to understand and orchestrate story events in a specific order to form a logical plot that follows narrative conventions. Sequencing is extremely important in everything we do, and it's a skill that we often take for granted and can seem difficult to teach because it's such a basic skill. Hilary will now talk a bit more about this.
I'll be going through why sequencing is important. Sequencing skills allow students to recognize patterns that make the world more understandable and predictable as well. Developing a strong foundation of sequencing skills ensures that children continually meet the demands of both academic and daily tasks. For school-aged children in particular, they would use sequencing to read, to write, structure conversation, and follow instructions as well. Supporting sequencing skills can therefore lead to positive gains across literacy, language, communication skills, and social interactions. In general, sequencing skills are important across all levels of oral and written language, including the use of sounds, words, sentences, and discourse level language. Discourse level language includes things like verbal written monologues, conversation, recounts, or stories. Story sequencing skills are also important for students to retell past events or stories, either verbally or in writing. What sequencing does is it breaks the retell into smaller, more manageable tasks, because rather than trying to retell the story as a whole, students are able to retell the main ideas from the beginning, the middle, and the end. This ensures that their story retell follows a logical order as they happened in the original text. Sequencing is also required for verbal or written recounts of past events. Appropriate sequencing ensures that students recount past events in a logical or chronological order so that others can follow their story. This can include temporal and ordinal concepts such as first, next, and last, or first, second, and third. Recounts are important academically, but informal verbal recounts between family and peers also serve a social purpose and encourage social participation as well. Sequencing skills are also important for following verbal directions. Directions are a part of daily life. In the classroom context, following instructions can promote appropriate behavior, academic success, and overall effective completion of task expectations. To follow multi-step classroom instructions, the student must process and carry out the sequence of steps in a logical order. Sequencing skills are also important for giving verbal directions, not just following them. Students will need to arrange their own instructions in a logical or preferred sequence. Sequencing can also affect how well students follow activities and routines. In the classroom in particular, sequencing skills are required for students to understand and to follow class schedules and timetables. It can help the student complete tasks, understand when a task is completed, and transition to new tasks. I'll now be talking about how to teach sequencing skills. It's often recommended that sequencing skills are taught systematically so that children can acquire and consolidate the skill over time. So it's recommended to start with visuals before moving on to the oral and then the written modalities. Starting with the visual modality will allow the child to focus entirely on building just their sequencing skills. What we see in the oral and written modalities is that some students might have difficulties filtering and sorting which parts are relevant to the sequence. So the first step in teaching sequencing is having the child understand that two events can happen in a certain order and to learn the necessary vocabulary, such as first and last, first and next, or first and second. I've got a few examples on the slides there. You'll need two basic and familiar pictures that represent these concepts. Ideally, these pictures are familiar and recognizable to the child. You can use everyday or you can use academic routines. You can start the teaching process by providing a demonstration. So you can put the pictures in order, point to each card and say, first we wear socks, next we wear shoes. Once the child is more familiar with the vocabulary, you can start asking the student to rearrange two-step visuals. You can do this by asking questions like, what happened first? What happened next? Once the child is consistently identifying the correct sequence without help, you can move on to the next step. The next step is to sequence 3 steps that are familiar. As previously done, you can start by providing a demonstration. Describe the sequence using the words first, next, and last, or first, second, and third. After you've introduced that new vocabulary, you can ask the child to rearrange the pictures themselves by asking what happened first, what happened second, what happened last. The next step involves moving on entirely to the verbal modality. In this step, you can ask the student to tell the steps of the event. You can say, tell me all the steps to brushing your teeth. Ideally, the student will verbally relay the steps by saying, first I squeeze, next I brush, last I spit. Initially, you can provide prompting to support the child. You can use prompting questions like, what do you do first? You can also start a sentence by saying, first, I, and then trail off for the student to complete the sentence. The next step follows the same process, but you can start to move on to 4-step, 5-step, and potentially 6-step instructions, depending on the child's ability. The last step is to support the student to sequence more abstract things like stories and past events. This can occur either verbally or in a written modality. So it's recommended to start with picture books, familiar short stories, and then longer, unfamiliar short stories. Initially, you can help the student by showing them key pictures from the picture book to help with their recall of the story events. You can also help by asking the student what happened next. Students can also use a visual scaffold or organizer to map out their story sequence before they verbally retell the story. Once the student is proficient with sequencing longer, unfamiliar stories, you can start working on sequencing past events. You can ask the child about what happened during a very recent activity before moving on to activities that happened further in the past, such as their weekend, the previous school term, or their last holiday. This is a systematic approach to teaching sequencing skills, but students will be able to apply these skills in a range of different activities and concepts. These can include things like class schedules, personal timetables, reading and writing tasks, and interacting with others. Lauren will now be going through some examples of sequencing.
So here are some examples of how sequencing can be used in a classroom and at home. And a lot of these may already be familiar, or you may have already been implementing them in your classrooms. So this first one is a classroom timetable of what happens throughout the day. It can make the school days appear less overwhelming if it's split up into smaller sections of time. It's also a really good way to settle into the day where children can feel prepared and know what to expect during the day. Children might have a favourite subject or lunchtime to look forward to help keep them motivated. It also helps children to transition between tasks if they know what's going to happen next. This can help with behavioural issues. A child may not want to move on if they're really enjoying their current activity, such as sport or playtime. A visual timetable will help them understand what they need done before the end of the day. This also really helps with encouraging full participation in a classroom setting. So this next one is a homework visual schedule, and this is particularly helpful for children who may struggle to meet deadlines. Assignments and homework can become overwhelming when they pile up, and providing a homework schedule or teaching children how to manage their workload is a good way for them to organise and prioritise tasks. So they could put down in order of which tasks are due earlier and complete those earlier on in the week. Or they could allocate a day to complete a small task at a time. So here is a scaffold for written work, and plans and scaffolds are great examples of sequencing. They can help children to organise their ideas and know what order to express them in for it to make sense. So it allows them to brainstorm their ideas and write it down to visualise what order the paragraph or text should be written in. An excellent learning tool that becomes more natural the more it's used is an example given on the slide here. So the hamburger paragraph, having the topic sentence, the supporting sentence 1, supporting sentence 2 and 3, and then ending with a concluding sentence. It's really good for children to use when their stories or sentences are always jumbled and out of order. So here are some ways for children to practice sequencing. So such as writing a recipe for someone else to follow, such as making pancakes or making slime. There are lots of fun and practical ways for children to learn the importance of sequencing and following instructions in order. They could learn this by writing a recipe or procedure for something and teaching someone else how to do it. Or they could try and follow it themselves. And if there are any mistakes, such as if they put the flour in the pan before mixing in the wet ingredients, they'll learn why it's really important to do things in the right order. Songs or books are also a great way. So for younger children, it's really important to build a foundation to learn simple things like the days of the week, the months of the year, numbers, the alphabet. And there are lots of songs that are super catchy and easy to learn from. Once they've mastered this, they can start learning skills to create schedules and other forms of sequencing and learning that they'll need in later years of education. So we hope you found this presentation useful and have been inspired to try some of these sequencing tips in your classroom. Thank you.